Have you ever noticed how some gardens seem to quietly pull birds in again and again, while others just stay empty no matter what you do? At first, it almost feels random, like a bird just happens to pass by, stops for a moment, then moves on. Nothing special. But if you pay closer attention, that idea starts to fall apart. Because birds don't really show up without reason, and when they keep returning to the same spot, there's usually something happening in that space that most people never think about. It's not about how pretty the garden looks. It's not luck either. It's something much more subtle, almost invisible at first glance. So the real question is simple. What exactly are they reacting to when they choose to come back again? One of the biggest reasons birds keep coming back to a garden isn't what most people expect. It's actually something surprisingly simple: memory. Birds don't just show up, grab food, and forget about it. They remember places. If a bird finds even a small amount of food in your garden once, maybe a few seeds or crumbs, it doesn't treat it like a random moment. It treats it like information. That spot gets marked in its mind, and then something interesting happens. Days later, sometimes even weeks later, that same bird can come back and check the exact same area again. Not because it's certain something will be there, but because it remembers that something was there before. It's a quiet kind of checking, almost automatic. And over time, your garden stops being just another physical space in the background. It becomes part of a mental map the bird is building as it moves through the world, a place connected to survival, a place worth revisiting. What makes this even more interesting is how little it actually takes to create that connection. It doesn't require feeding birds every day. It doesn't require anything complicated. Just one small moment can be enough for the brain to tag that location and keep it stored. And once that tag exists, it's not easily removed. The bird doesn't need to think about it consciously. It just returns. Almost like the memory itself is pulling it back, even when nothing obvious is happening in the moment. Food alone isn't actually enough to make birds keep coming back to a garden. There's something just as important, and in many cases, even more important than food: safety. Out in the wild, every time a bird lands somewhere, it's taking a small risk. It might not look like it from the outside, but for the bird, it's constantly scanning and evaluating everything around it, trying to answer one simple question: is this place safe or not? If a garden feels calm, quiet, and predictable, that changes everything. Even small details start to matter. A bit of cover from bushes or trees, fewer sudden movements, a space that doesn't feel chaotic or unpredictable. Sometimes even just stillness is enough to make a difference. And if there's water nearby, that sense of safety becomes even stronger, not just for drinking, but for survival, comfort in general. Because safety isn't only about avoiding danger, it's about how relaxed a bird can be in that moment. Whether it feels exposed or protected, whether it feels like it needs to leave quickly or can actually stay for a while. Birds don't stick around in places where they only find food. They stay in places where they don't feel like something is waiting to scare them away, or worse, something that might turn them into prey. And once a space consistently gives that feeling of security, something subtle starts to change. The visits aren't just quick stops anymore. They become returns, because the place no longer feels unfamiliar. It starts to feel trusted. There's something most people never really think about when they watch birds come and go. We tend to imagine them just flying around randomly, stopping wherever something looks interesting in the moment. But that's not really how it works. Birds actually follow patterns. Not fixed routes like a map on paper, but invisible paths shaped by repetition, memory, and what's worked for them before. Over time, they learn which areas are worth checking, which stops usually have something useful, and which places can be trusted. It becomes a kind of mental shortcut for survival. So when a garden sits along one of these familiar paths, something subtle starts to happen. You might notice birds showing up more regularly, not just once in a while, but almost like they're passing through on a schedule. And it doesn't necessarily mean they chose your garden specifically. It might just mean your space became part of a route they already rely on, a place they naturally pass through because it fits into what they've already learned about the environment. And once that happens, the whole dynamic changes. It's no longer about attracting birds in the moment. It becomes part of a routine they've already built into their movement. One of the most powerful factors behind birds returning to a garden isn't something physical at all. It's social behavior. Birds watch each other constantly, not in an obvious way, but in quick, instinctive checks of what others are doing. And that changes everything. If one bird lands in your garden and feels safe enough to stay for a moment, that alone becomes information. Because in nature, survival isn't just personal, it's learned through observation. One bird feeding in a spot quietly sends a signal, "This place is safe enough to try." When a second bird joins in, that signal gets stronger. It's no longer just a test. It starts to feel confirmed. And when a small group begins to gather, the effect builds fast, almost like momentum. From the outside, it can look random, but for birds, it's more like a silent agreement forming in real time. One arrival might be coincidence, but multiple birds in the same place starts to feel like proof. And once that kind of signal spreads, something shifts. Your garden isn't just being visited anymore, it's being validated. And that changes how every new bird sees it from that moment on. Food usually gets all the attention when people think about attracting birds. But in reality, water often plays a much bigger role than most people realize. Birds don't just need it to drink when they're thirsty. They rely on water to cool down in heat, to clean their feathers, and to keep their bodies in condition for flight. Without it, even a good feeding spot feels incomplete. When a garden has a reliable source of water, it becomes something different, not just a place to quickly stop by, but a place where birds can actually pause and recover. And unlike food, which can disappear in a moment, water tends to feel more consistent. It's something birds can count on returning to. That consistency matters, because in the end, it's not just about attracting birds once, it's about giving them a reason to come back again and again. And in many cases, something as simple as water is enough to create that pattern, even if nothing else changes. But here's the part most people don't really expect. You might not have ever planned for this at all. No setup, no intention. No, I'm trying to attract birds moment. And yet, your garden could still be doing it on its own. A small puddle left behind after rain that never fully dries. A quiet corner where plants grow a little thicker and denser than the rest. Maybe even leftover pet food that sits outside longer than you realize. Or sometimes, it's just the natural shape of the space itself. Nothing special on its own. But together, these little details start to add up. And from a bird's point of view, it quietly becomes something useful. Over time, that usefulness turns into recognition. And recognition turns into return visits. So, in a way, you're not really attracting birds on purpose. You might just be offering pieces of what they're already looking for out in the wild, without even noticing. When you start looking at it this way, a garden stops being just decoration. It becomes something much more active, something that's quietly part of a living system you don't always notice. A space that exists inside the memory, movement, and small decisions of birds and other creatures passing through it every day. And maybe that's the part most people miss. We usually think of nature as something outside of us, something that comes and goes, like birds flying through our yard for a moment and then disappearing again. But in reality, it's not always that separate. Sometimes, the space we live in becomes part of that system without us even realizing it. So the next time you notice birds coming back again and again, it might be worth slowing down for a second. What are they actually seeing here that I'm not paying attention to? And even more interesting, what is this space communicating to them without saying a single word? Because once you start thinking like that, it changes how you look at everything around you. Not just birds, but the whole environment you live in every day.